A homeless single dad saved a CEO's life on a freezing street corner. He never knew one act of courage would change everything. Tonight, I'm sharing the story of Landon Pierce, a former soldier living on the streets with nothing but a sleeping bag and the determination to rebuild his life for his son. On a cold November evening, he witnessed something horrific. Outside a corporate high-rise, a woman being attacked by muggers who left her bleeding on the pavement. While everyone else walked past, Landon ran toward the danger, applied pressure to her wounds, and called 911. What he didn't know was that the woman he saved, Brielle Douglas, was one of the most powerful CEOs in the city. And what she would offer him in return would test everything he thought he knew about second chances, redemption, and whether society truly values the homeless. Stay with me until the end and comment below with your city so I can see how far this story travels around the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind cut through downtown like a blade, turning the streets of Ashford City into a test of endurance that most people failed simply by avoiding it altogether. They hurried from heated cars to heated buildings, collars turned up, faces buried in scarves, never making eye contact with the figures huddled in doorways and under awnings. Landon Pierce sat against the cold brick wall of the Stanton Tower parking garage, his sleeping bag pulled tight around his shoulders, watching the evening rush hour flow past like a river that had long ago decided he wasn't worth carrying along. He was 36 years old, though the streets had aged him in ways that made strangers assume he was pushing 50. His beard was thick and unkempt, his jacket worn through at the elbows, his boots held together with duct tape and prayers. But his eyes were clear, alert, focused on the phone in his hands that he kept charged at the public library every afternoon, the one lifeline he refused to give up no matter how hungry he got or how cold the nights became. On the screen was a photo. A boy, 8 years old, with gap-toothed smile and eyes that held all the innocence Landon had lost somewhere along the way. His son, his reason for everything, his reason for still being alive. The photo was from 3 weeks ago, the last time he'd been allowed a supervised visit at the community center on Oak Street. 2 hours, that's all the family court judge had granted him. 2 hours every other week to sit across a table from his boy, to hear about school and friends and the new video game he was playing, to pretend that everything was normal, and Dad was just busy with work, instead of sleeping in doorways and begging for change. Landon closed his eyes against the memory of how that visit had ended, how his son, whose name was Tyler, had hugged him tight and whispered, "When are you coming home, Dad? I miss you." And Landon had lied, had said, "Soon, buddy, real soon." Because what else could he say? That home didn't exist anymore. That mom had remarried and moved Tyler into a new house with a new father figure who had a job and a car and everything Landon used to have before it all fell apart. He checked the time, 6:15. The shelter opened at 7, but the line would already be forming. 50 beds. Maybe 100 people. Hoping to get inside before the temperature dropped below freezing tonight. Landon had learned to arrive early, to stake his claim, to be grateful for a warm floor and a thin blanket, even if it meant sleeping surrounded by strangers who coughed and snored and sometimes screamed in their sleep. But first, he needed to eat. His stomach had been empty since yesterday afternoon when the soup kitchen on Westbrook Avenue had served watery chicken broth and stale bread. He'd saved half the bread in his pocket for today, but it was gone now, consumed during the long cold afternoon, spent sitting outside the library until closing time. Landon pulled himself to his feet, joints protesting, muscles stiff from hours of immobility. He folded his sleeping bag carefully, tucking it into the oversized backpack that held everything he owned in the world. 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, a bar of soap, the papers from family court, a photograph of Tyler from 3 years ago when they'd gone to the beach, both of them grinning in the sunshine, back when Landon had been a different person living a different life. He'd been a machine operator at the Brookfield manufacturing plant back then. Good job, decent pay, health insurance, and a future. But then the plant had shut down, moved operations overseas, and suddenly, Landon was one of 300 workers with nothing but a severance check that lasted 3 months if you stretched it. He'd looked for work, had applied to every factory and warehouse and construction company within 50 miles. But jobs were scarce and applicants were plenty. And somehow the months kept passing with nothing but rejection letters and dwindling savings. The apartment went first, then the car, then his wife's patience. She tried to hold on, had worked double shifts at the diner, while Landon took odd jobs that paid under the table and barely covered groceries. But eventually, she'd made a choice. Her and Tyler needed stability, needed a roof over their heads and food on the table, and Landon couldn't provide that anymore. The divorce papers came on a Tuesday. The custody arrangement gave her primary physical custody, gave Landon supervised visits twice a month, gave him the requirement to pay support he had no way of paying. He'd tried to explain to the judge that he was looking for work, that he was doing everything possible, but the judge had been unsympathetic. Get a job, any job, and start meeting your obligations. Simple as that. Except, it wasn't simple. Not when you had no address for job applications. Not when you had no phone number for callbacks. Not when you showed up to interviews smelling like the streets and looking like someone employers crossed the street to avoid. Landon had been homeless for 8 months now. 8 months of shelters and soup kitchens, of panhandling on corners and collecting cans for the 5-cent redemption, of watching the world move forward while he stood still. 8 months of missing his son, of supervised visits that never felt like enough, of promises he couldn't keep and hope that grew thinner with each passing day. He walked down Harrison Street toward the business district, passing restaurants where people sat in warm booths eating meals that cost more than Landon made in a week. His plan was simple. There was a coffee shop on the corner of Harrison and 5th that sometimes had day-old pastries they threw out around closing time. If he timed it right, if he was polite and didn't make a scene, sometimes the manager would hand him a bag instead of tossing it in the dumpster. It wasn't much, but it was something. And on the streets, something was everything. The Stanton Tower rose above him as he walked. 40 stories of glass and steel, where people made salaries Landon couldn't even comprehend anymore. He'd heard it housed some big tech company, some corporation that did something with software, or data, or whatever it was that rich people did to get richer. He'd never been inside, never would be inside, but he walked past it every day on his way to the soup kitchen, or the library, or wherever else he needed to go. Tonight, the tower's entrance was busy with workers leaving for the day. Men in suits, women in heels, all of them clutching briefcases and phones, all of them in a hurry to get somewhere warm. They flowed around Landon like water around a stone, not seeing him, not acknowledging his existence. He'd gotten used to that. The invisibility, the way people looked through him instead of at him. But Landon still saw them, still noticed the designer clothes and expensive watches, the casual way they tossed coins in the trash or left perfectly good food on restaurant tables. He didn't resent them exactly. He just remembered being one of them, back when he'd been the guy in the decent jacket rushing home to his family, too busy with his own life to notice the people society had forgotten. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from the caseworker at Family Services reminding him about his next supervised visit. This Saturday, 2 hours. Don't be late. Landon stared at the message, feeling that familiar mixture of joy and pain. 2 more days until he got to see Tyler. 2 more days of surviving on these streets, of staying safe and sane and alive. Then 2 precious hours with his son, followed by 2 more weeks of counting down until the next visit. He was so focused on his phone that he almost didn't notice the commotion ahead. The screaming started at exactly 6:47 inches the evening, just as the sun was setting behind the Ashford city skyline and painting the streets in shades of amber and shadow. Landon looked up from his phone to see a woman stumbling out of the Stanton Tower entrance, her hand pressed against her side, her face twisted in pain and terror. She was maybe 40, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that was now stained dark with blood spreading from beneath her fingers. Her other hand clutched a designer purse that dragged on the ground as she staggered forward. Behind her, 2 figures emerged from the tower's side alley. Young men, maybe early 20s, both wearing dark hoodies pulled low over their faces. They moved with the jerky energy of adrenaline and panic, looking around frantically, as if deciding whether to run or finish what they'd started. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The woman collapsed to her knees on the sidewalk, still 20 feet from the tower entrance, still clutching her side. Blood was running between her fingers now, dripping onto the concrete in dark drops that looked black in the fading light. "Help," she gasped, her voice barely carrying across the distance. "Someone help me." The evening crowd scattered like startled birds. People who'd been walking toward the entrance suddenly veered away, pulling out phones, backing toward their cars. A woman in heels stumbled as she rushed to get distance, nearly falling. A man in a business suit held up his phone, filming the scene, instead of helping. The two attackers stood frozen for a moment, staring at their victim. Then one of them grabbed the other's arm, and they bolted, sprinting south down Harrison Street, hoodies flapping, footsteps echoing off the buildings. They disappeared around the corner in seconds, swallowed by the lengthening shadows. And the woman stayed on her knees, blood pooling around her, one hand pressed uselessly against a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Landon's body made the decision before his mind caught up. He was moving, his backpack thudding against his spine as he ran toward her, his worn boots slapping against the concrete. Around him, people were pulling back, creating a circle of space as if the violence was contagious, as if getting too close might infect them with whatever terrible luck had struck this woman down. But Landon had seen worse. Had held dying friends in his arms overseas, before he'd returned home, and tried to build a normal life. Had learned that when someone was bleeding, you didn't think, you didn't hesitate, you just acted. Training kicked in, muscle memory from another lifetime taking over. He dropped to his knees beside her just as she started to slump forward. His hands caught her shoulders, steadying her, and her eyes found his. They were gray, sharp despite the pain, intelligent even in crisis. "I've got you," Landon said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I'm here. You're going to be okay." "They stabbed me," she gasped. Blood flecked her lips. "Tried to take my purse and I fought back and they..." "Don't talk. Save your strength." Landon's eyes went to the wound. Her hand was pressed against her left side, just below her ribs. Blood was seeping around her fingers. Too much blood, the kind of bleeding that meant serious damage. "I need to see it. Can you move your hand?" She did, trembling, and Landon's stomach dropped. The wound was deep, ragged, the kind of puncture that meant internal damage, organs potentially compromised. He'd seen wounds like this before. This woman had minutes, not hours. He shrugged off his jacket despite the cold and pressed it against the wound, applying firm, steady pressure. The woman cried out, her body going rigid with pain. "I know it hurts," Landon said, "but I have to stop the bleeding. Just hold on. You're going to make it." "Call 911, someone shouted from the growing crowd. A security guard had emerged from the tower entrance, young and scared-looking. "Someone call an ambulance." "Already calling," a woman's voice responded. Landon kept his focus on the injured woman, on maintaining pressure, on keeping her conscious and aware. Her face was going pale, shock setting in, her breathing shallow and rapid. "What's your name?" he asked, knowing he needed to keep her talking, keep her engaged, fight the shock that wanted to pull her under. "Brielle," she whispered. "Brielle Douglas." "Okay, Brielle. I'm Landon. I need you to stay with me, okay? Keep talking. Tell me about yourself." "CEO," she managed. "Stanton Industries. Top floor." Landon processed this information with surprise he didn't let show. The CEO. He was holding pressure on a wound for someone who probably made more in a day than he'd made in a year back when he had a job. But right now, that didn't matter. Right now, she was just a person who was bleeding and needed help. "Okay, CEO Brielle. That's impressive. I bet you've got important meetings tomorrow." People counting on you. So you need to hang on. You understand? She nodded weakly, her eyes starting to flutter closed. No, Landon said sharply. Eyes open. Look at me. Stay awake. Her eyes snapped open, focusing on his face with effort. Hurts, she breathed. I know, but you're tough. I can tell. You fought back against those guys, instead of just giving them what they wanted. That takes courage. Stupid, she whispered. Should have let them take it. Maybe, but you didn't. And now you're going to survive this, and you're going to have one hell of a story to tell at board meetings. A tiny smile flickered across her face before pain wiped it away. Who are you? She asked, her eyes taking in his appearance for the first time. The beard, the worn clothes, the smell of the streets that clung to him like a second skin. Why did you help? Because you needed help, Landon said simply. And I was here. The wail of sirens cut through the air, growing closer. Red and blue lights painted the buildings, reflecting off glass and steel. The crowd had grown larger, people gathering to watch, to film on their phones, to witness the drama unfolding on their evening commute. Landon ignored them all. His world had narrowed to this woman, this wound, this moment. His jacket was soaked through with blood now, warm and sticky against his hands. He could feel her heartbeat under his palms, rapid and thready. She was going into shock, her body shutting down from blood loss and trauma. Stay with me, Brielle, he said urgently. Ambulance is almost here. You just need to hold on a little longer. Her hand came up, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. Thank you, she whispered. Don't leave. I'm not going anywhere, Landon promised. The ambulance screamed to a stop at the curb, doors flying open, paramedics rushing out with equipment and urgent voices. But Landon kept his position, kept the pressure on the wound, kept his eyes locked on Brielle's face. Sir, we've got it from here, a paramedic said, kneeling beside him with a trauma kit. Landon moved back, his hands dark with blood, and watched as the professionals took over. They worked with practiced efficiency, cutting away her jacket, placing pressure bandages, starting an IV line, calling out vitals and medical jargon he only half understood. Within minutes, they had Brielle on a stretcher, an oxygen mask over her face, fluids running into her arm. As they loaded her into the ambulance, her eyes found his one more time through the crowd of paramedics and equipment. She tried to say something, but the oxygen mask muffled her words. Then the ambulance doors closed, and she was gone, sirens screaming as the vehicle pulled away into the night. And Landon stood there in the middle of the sidewalk, his hands covered in blood, his jacket ruined, staring at the space where the ambulance had been. The police arrived within minutes of the ambulance's departure, 3 cruisers surrounding the scene with lights flashing. Officers began cordoning off the area with yellow tape, shouting at the crowd to back up, to give them room to work. Crime scene investigators appeared with cameras and evidence markers, photographing blood spatter and documenting the attack site. Landon tried to step back, to fade into the crowd the way he'd learned to do over 8 months, on the streets, invisible, unnoticed, just another face no one would remember. But a hand caught his arm, firm but not rough. Sir, I need you to stay right here. The police officer was young, maybe 25, with sharp eyes that took in Landon's appearance in a single sweep. Homeless, covered in blood, standing at the scene of a violent crime. The officer's other hand moved to his belt, resting near his weapon. Don't move. I didn't do anything wrong, Landon said, raising his hands automatically, showing his palms despite the blood staining them. I was helping her. I called 911. Someone called 911, the officer corrected. But you're covered in the victim's blood, so I need you to stay right there until we figure out what happened. Another officer approached, older, with sergeant stripes on his sleeve and the weathered look of someone who'd seen everything the streets had to offer. His name tag read, Sullivan. He looked at Landon, then at the blood, then back at Landon's face. This, The one who applied pressure? Sullivan asked. Security guard says he ran to help right after the attack. The younger officer confirmed, nodding toward the tower entrance where the security guard was giving a statement to another police officer. Sullivan studied Landon more carefully. What's your name, son? Landon Pierce. You see what happened? Two guys in dark hoodies came out of that alley. Landon pointed. She stumbled out after them, already stabbed. They saw her fall and ran south down Harrison. I came over and applied pressure to the wound until the paramedics arrived. You know the victim? Never seen her before tonight. She said her name was Brielle Douglas. Said she's the CEO of Stanton Industries. Sullivan's eyebrows rose slightly. You just happened to be here when the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company got stabbed. The implication in his tone was clear. Too convenient. Too suspicious. Landon felt his chest tighten with familiar frustration and fear. This was how it always went. Homeless man near a crime scene equals automatic suspect. Didn't matter that he'd helped. Didn't matter that he'd possibly saved her life. All that mattered was what he looked like and where he'd come from. I was walking to the shelter on Maple Street, Landon said, keeping his voice calm and respectful the way he'd learned you had to when dealing with police while homeless. Any hint of attitude or anger and things escalated fast. I pass by this building every evening. I saw her stumble out. Saw she was hurt. And I helped. That's all. That's all. Sullivan repeated, his tone neutral. He looked at Landon's hands, at the blood drying dark under his fingernails. You former EMT or something? Security guard said you seemed to know what you were doing with the wound. Landon hesitated. Talking about his past always felt like admitting failure, like highlighting everything he'd once been and lost. But right now, it might be the only thing that kept him from being arrested. I served overseas, he said quietly. Saw some combat. Learned field medicine. Sullivan's expression shifted slightly, not quite softening but reassessing. What branch? Army. 3 years active duty. When did you get out? 5 years ago. Sullivan nodded slowly, processing this information. Around them, the crime scene investigation continued. Photographers were documenting blood spatter patterns. Officers were interviewing witnesses. Someone had found Brielle's purse lying near where she'd fallen, its contents spilled across the sidewalk. Look, Sullivan said finally, we're going to need a formal statement from you. And we'll need to document your clothing as evidence since you made direct contact with the victim. He paused. You willing to cooperate? It wasn't really a question. Landon knew that if he refused, he'd be taken to the station in handcuffs instead of as a witness. Yes, sir. I'll cooperate. Good. Sullivan gestured to the younger officer. Get him cleaned up and take his statement. And someone find this man a jacket. It's freezing out here. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of questions and paperwork. Landon was taken to a police station 3 blocks away, given soap to wash the blood from his hands, provided with a statement form that asked him to recount every detail he could remember. He wrote carefully, trying to be thorough, trying to give them useful information about the attackers even though he'd barely seen their faces. Height, approximate 5'10", and 6'1". Build, average to thin. Age, early 20s. Clothing, dark hoodies, jeans, sneakers. One had a green logo on his hoodie, maybe a sports team. They'd run south after the attack, moving fast, panicked. That was all he had. An officer took photos of his blood-stained jacket and pants, bagged them as evidence, and provided him with replacement clothes from a donation box. The jacket was too big and smelled like mothballs, but it was warm. The pants almost fit. By the time they finished, it was nearly 9 at night. The shelter would be full by now. All 50 beds claimed by people who'd arrived earlier. Landon would be sleeping on the streets tonight, finding a doorway or an alley where he could huddle in his sleeping bag and hope to survive until morning. You're free to go, Sullivan said, appearing in the doorway of the interview room. If we need anything else, we'll be in touch. Landon stood, gathering his backpack. How is she? The woman I helped, Did she make it? Sullivan hesitated, then nodded. Last I heard, she was in surgery, but stable. You saved her life, Pierce. That wound would have killed her in minutes if you hadn't applied pressure when you did. Something loosened in Landon's chest. She'd made it. Despite everything, despite the violence, and the blood, and the fear, Brielle Douglas was going to survive. He'd done something good. For the first time in 8 months of feeling useless and invisible and worthless, he'd made a difference. I'm glad, Landon said simply. For what it's worth, Sullivan added. That was a brave thing you did. Running toward danger, instead of away from it. Not many people would have done that. She needed help. Still, Sullivan extended his hand, and after a moment, Landon shook it. Take care of yourself out there, Pierce. And if you need resources, shelters, job programs, whatever, there's information at the front desk. Landon nodded, knowing he'd probably looked at those same resources 100 times before, knowing they rarely led anywhere for someone in his situation. But he appreciated the gesture. He walked out of the police station into the cold November night, his new jacket pulled tight, his backpack heavy on his shoulders. The streets were quieter now, most people safe in their homes. The late evening, belonging to the desperate and the determined. Landon found a doorway 2 blocks from the station, tucked into an alcove that provided some shelter from the wind. He spread out his sleeping bag, climbed inside, and pulled it up to his chin. His hands still smelled faintly of blood despite the scrubbing. His body ached from kneeling on cold concrete. His mind kept replaying the moment when he'd seen Brielle collapse, the decision he'd made in a split second to help instead of walking away. He pulled out his phone, looking at Tyler's photo one more time before the battery died. 3 more days until he'd see his son. 3 more days of surviving these streets. Then 2 precious hours of being dad again. Of pretending everything was okay. Landon closed his eyes and tried to sleep, unaware that his life had just changed forever, that the woman he'd saved was already making plans, that courage came with consequences he couldn't yet imagine. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tonight brought only cold and darkness, and the hope that he'd wake up to see another day. Landon woke to the sound of voices and the bright glare of camera lights in his face. He sat up abruptly, disoriented, his sleeping bag tangled around his legs, his heart hammering with the instinctive panic that came from being vulnerable on the streets. 3 people stood in the doorway alcove where he'd spent the night, silhouettes backlit by professional video equipment. Mr. Pierce? A woman's voice called out. Landon Pierce? I'm Amber Maxwell from Channel 7 News. Can we talk to you about what happened last night? Landon blinked against the lights, his mind struggling to catch up. Morning had come, pale winter sunlight filtering between buildings, and somehow the media had found him. He looked past the reporter to see a news van parked at the curb, its satellite dish extended, another cameraman filming from a different angle. How did you find me? Landon asked, his voice rough from sleep. The police report listed you as a witness. Amber explained. She was in her 30s, professionally dressed, with the polished appearance of someone who'd never spent a night wondering where they'd sleep. We've been looking for you since dawn. The security guard at Stanton Tower told us which direction you usually walked. A shop owner 2 blocks over remembered seeing you head this way last night. Of course. His routines, his patterns, the predictable movements of someone with limited options. On the streets, you became known by the places you frequented, the routes you traveled. Privacy was a luxury Landon couldn't afford. I don't want to be on the news, Landon said, starting to pack up his sleeping bag. I just helped someone who needed help. That's all. That's exactly why people need to hear your story. Amber pressed forward, her cameraman following. You saved the life of Brielle Douglas, one of the most prominent business leaders in this city. You're a hero, Mr. Pierce. I'm not a hero. I'm just a guy who was in the right place at the right time. A homeless veteran who ran toward danger to save a stranger. Amber continued, clearly having done her research. That's the kind of story that needs to be told, especially now, when so many people walk past those in need without a second glance. Landon finished rolling his sleeping bag and stood, shouldering his backpack. Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I have somewhere I need to be. Please. Just 5 minutes. Tell people what happened in your own words. He started to walk away, but Amber followed, her cameraman keeping pace. Mr. Pierce, Brielle Douglas is in stable condition this morning thanks to you. Her family released a statement saying you saved her life. Don't you think people should know who you are? What you did? Landon stopped walking. She's okay? She came through surgery successfully. The doctors say if you hadn't applied pressure when you did, she would have bled out before the ambulance arrived. Amber's expression softened slightly. You gave her a chance to live. That matters. Despite himself, Landon felt relief wash through him. She'd made it. The woman whose blood had soaked his jacket, whose gray eyes had locked on his with desperate trust, was going to survive. I'm glad she's okay, Landon said quietly. Will you tell people what happened, just briefly? He looked at the camera, at the red recording light, at his own reflection in the lens. Unshaven, unwashed, wearing donated clothes that didn't fit, looking exactly like what he was. A man society had forgotten. Part of him wanted to refuse, to maintain what little dignity he had left. But another part, the part that remembered being invisible for 8 months, that remembered people looking through him like he didn't exist, wanted to be seen, just once. Wanted to matter. Okay, he said finally. 5 minutes. The interview was awkward and uncomfortable. Amber asked questions about what he'd witnessed, what he'd done, why he'd chosen to help. Landon answered honestly, keeping his responses simple and direct. He'd seen someone hurt. He'd known what to do, from his time in the service. He'd acted because it was the right thing to do. That was all. But Amber pushed for more, asked about his situation, about being homeless, about how he'd ended up on the streets. Landon deflected most of it, unwilling to air his failures on television, unwilling to become a sob story for people's morning coffee consumption. When it was over, Amber thanked him and handed him a business card. If you need anything, call me. And Mr. Pierce, you should know that Brielle Douglas has been asking about you. She wants to thank you personally. By noon, Landon's face was everywhere. The interview had aired on the morning news and been picked up by every other station in the city. Video of him kneeling beside Brielle, his hands covered in blood, had gone viral on social media. Headlines screamed variations of the same theme. Homeless hero saves CEO. Veteran living on streets rescues billionaire. Single father's courage saves life. People recognized him as he walked through downtown. Some wanted to shake his hand, to thank him for restoring their faith in humanity. Others pressed money into his palm, 5s and 10s and 20s, telling him he deserved it, that he was an inspiration. A restaurant owner insisted on giving him a free meal, seating him at the best table despite his appearance, despite the other customers' stares. It was overwhelming and surreal. After 8 months of being invisible, Landon was suddenly the most visible person in Ashford City, and he hated it, because with visibility came scrutiny. News outlets dug into his background, finding the details he'd wanted to keep private: his divorce, his custody situation, the fact that he only saw his son twice a month under supervision. His ex-wife was contacted for comment, and though she refused to speak on camera, anonymous sources shared quotes about his struggles and his inability to provide stability. By evening, the narrative had shifted slightly. Yes, he was a hero, but he was also a cautionary tale. A veteran failed by the system, a father separated from his son, a man who'd fallen through society's cracks and was living proof that heroism didn't guarantee success or happiness or basic human dignity. Landon sat in the library that afternoon, charging his phone and watching the coverage on the public computers. Tyler's supervised visit was tomorrow, and he dreaded having to explain all of this to his 8-year-old son. How did you tell your boy that Dad was famous now, but still homeless, still struggling, still unable to provide the stability every parent was supposed to offer? His phone rang. An unknown number. Landon almost didn't answer, assuming it was another reporter who'd somehow gotten his contact information. But something made him pick up on the fourth ring. Mr. Pierce. The voice was professional, female, with the crisp efficiency of someone used to handling important matters. My name is Vanessa Palmer. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Stanton Industries. Miss Douglas would like to speak with you. Would you be available to visit her at Ashford Medical Center this evening? Landon's grip tightened on the phone. She wants to see me? She's been asking about you since she regained consciousness. She'd like to thank you personally for what you did. Vanessa paused. We can send a car to pick you up. Would 6 o'clock work? He thought about refusing. About maintaining distance between his world and Brielle Douglas's world. About not crossing lines that probably shouldn't be crossed. But curiosity won out. And maybe, underneath it all, a small hope that this woman whose life he'd saved might see him as more than just a headline or a charity case. 6 o'clock is fine, Landon said. Excellent. Where should the car meet you? Landon gave her the address of the library, unwilling to admit he didn't have a real address to provide. After the call ended, he sat staring at the phone screen, wondering what he'd just agreed to. His reflection looked back at him from the darkened screen. Still unshaven. Still wearing donated clothes. Still homeless, despite the attention and the praise and the money strangers had pressed into his hands throughout the day. Tomorrow, he'd see Tyler. Tonight, he'd see the woman he'd saved. And somehow, Landon suspected, his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The car that arrived at 6 o'clock wasn't what Landon expected. He'd been imagining maybe a taxi or a basic sedan, something functional and forgettable. Instead, a sleek black town car pulled up to the library entrance, its windows tinted, its paint gleaming under the streetlights. The driver stepped out, a man in his 50s wearing a professional uniform. Mr. Pierce? Landon nodded, suddenly very aware of his appearance. He'd done his best to clean up, had washed his face in the library bathroom, had tried to comb his fingers through his hair. But there was only so much you could do when you lived on the streets. He still looked rough, still smelled faintly of the doorway where he'd slept, still wore clothes that didn't quite fit. Please, come with me. The driver opened the rear door with the same courtesy he'd probably show to any passenger, no judgment in his eyes, no disgust at Landon's appearance. The interior of the car was luxury incarnate. Leather seats, climate control, a partition between front and back that afforded privacy. Landon settled into the seat carefully, afraid to touch anything, afraid his presence would somehow contaminate this space that belonged to a different world entirely. The drive to Ashford Medical Center took 15 minutes through evening traffic. Landon watched the city pass by the tinted windows, seeing familiar streets from an unfamiliar vantage point. He'd walked these blocks 100 times, had panhandled on these corners, had slept in these doorways. But from inside this car, everything looked different, cleaner, more distant, less real. The hospital was on the north side of downtown, a modern facility that catered to those with excellent insurance or deep pockets. The driver pulled up to a private entrance rather than the main lobby, and before Landon could even reach for the door handle, it was being opened by a security guard. Mr. Pierce, please, follow me. They bypassed the main reception area entirely, taking a private elevator to the 8th floor. The executive wing, apparently, where rooms were more like hotel suites than hospital accommodations. The hallway was quiet, carpeted, decorated with actual artwork rather than generic prints. Vanessa Palmer met him outside room 847. She was in her early 40s, impeccably dressed in a navy business suit, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek bun. She extended her hand with a warm smile. Mr. Pierce, thank you so much for coming. Brielle has been anxious to see you. How is she? Landon asked, shaking her hand and feeling very conscious of his rough palm against her smooth one. Recovering well, thanks to you. The knife missed her major organs by millimeters. The doctors say your quick response and proper application of pressure made the difference between life and death. Vanessa's expression grew more serious. We owe you an enormous debt, Mr. Pierce. Before Landon could respond, the door to room 847 opened and a doctor emerged, reviewing notes on a tablet. He looked up, saw Vanessa, and nodded. She's awake and stable. 15 minutes, no more. She needs rest. Vanessa gestured for Landon to enter. I'll wait out here. The hospital room was indeed more suite than medical space. Large windows overlooking the city, comfortable furniture, equipment that looked state-of-the-art but was positioned discreetly to avoid feeling clinical. And in the bed, propped up on pillows, was Brielle Douglas. She looked different from the bleeding, terrified woman he'd held on the sidewalk. Her dark hair was clean and brushed, falling past her shoulders. Her face, though pale and drawn with pain, had regained some color. An IV line ran into her arm, and monitors beeped softly beside the bed, tracking vitals. But her gray eyes were the same, sharp and intelligent, and they lit up when she saw him. Landon, she said, her voice stronger than he'd expected. You came. Miss Douglas, he started, but she held up a hand. Brielle, please, I think we're past formalities, don't you? A slight smile. You've literally held my life in your hands. Landon moved closer to the bed, unsure of the proper protocol for this situation. How are you feeling? Like I got stabbed, she said with dark humor. But alive, which is more than I'd be if not for you. Her expression grew more serious, her eyes studying his face. The doctors told me what you did, how you applied pressure, how you kept me conscious, how you probably added years to my life by acting so quickly. I just did what anyone would do. No, her voice was firm. Most people ran away. I saw them scattering, pulling out phones to film instead of help, backing away like I was contagious. But you ran toward me. Why? Landon thought about how to answer that. I've seen people die from wounds like yours. I knew if someone didn't help, you'd bleed out in minutes. And I knew how to help, so I did. The news said you're a veteran, that you served overseas. 3 years, came home 5 years ago. And now you're living on the streets. It wasn't a question. She'd clearly seen the coverage, knew his situation. How does that happen? How does someone who serves their country, who has the courage to save strangers, end up homeless? The question was direct but not cruel. Genuine curiosity mixed with something that looked like anger, though Landon suspected it wasn't directed at him. Lost my job when the plant closed, he said simply. Couldn't find another one fast enough. Lost the apartment, then the car, then my family. It happens easier than you'd think. Brielle was quiet for a moment, her fingers plucking at the hospital blanket. I've built my entire career on the idea that hard work and merit determine success. That people who struggle just aren't trying hard enough. She looked up at him. You've made me question everything I thought I knew about how the world works. I don't understand. You saved my life, Landon. Without hesitation. Without expectation of reward. Despite having every reason to walk past and mind your own business. You're proof that character and worth have nothing to do with bank accounts or job titles. Her voice grew passionate despite her obvious pain. And society repays that character by leaving you to sleep in doorways? That's not just wrong. It's obscene. Landon didn't know what to say to that. He'd long ago accepted his situation as consequence rather than injustice, had blamed himself rather than the system. I want to help you, Brielle continued. I want to do something meaningful, not just hand you money and feel better about myself. You gave me my life back. Let me help you get yours back. Miss Douglas, Brielle, you don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. And more than that, I want to. She reached for a folder on the bedside table, wincing at the movement. Before those men attacked me, I was working late on a new initiative for Stanton Industries. We're launching a program to hire and train people who've been overlooked by traditional employment systems. Veterans, formerly incarcerated individuals, people experiencing homelessness. I need someone to run it. Someone who understands these communities from the inside. Landon stared at her. You want me to run a program? I want you to have a job, Landon. A real job with a real salary and benefits, and the stability you need to get your son back. Her eyes held his. I've done my research. I know about Tyler, about the custody arrangement, about the supervised visits. I know you're fighting to be a father to your boy. Let me help you fight. His throat tightened. The offer was impossible, too good to be real, the kind of thing that happened in movies, but not to people like him. I don't have experience running programs. I don't have a degree or qualifications or. You have lived experience. You have integrity. You have the courage to act when others freeze. Brielle's voice was firm. Those are the qualifications that matter to me. Everything else can be learned. Why? Landon asked. Why would you do this? Because you saved my life. Because I believe in second chances. Because I'm tired of living in a world where good people struggle, while mediocre people thrive, just because they were born into the right circumstances. She held out the folder. This is a formal job offer. Director of Community Integration Programs. Salary of $75,000 to start. Full benefits, company housing assistance while you get on your feet. Landon took the folder with shaking hands. $75,000. That was more money than he'd made even when he had a good job at the plant. That was stability. That was a chance to get Tyler back. That was a life. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Brielle said simply. Take the job. Change your life. Let me repay even a fraction of the debt I owe you. Landon sat in the hospital cafeteria at midnight. The job. Offer folder open in front of him. A cup of terrible coffee growing cold in his hands. Vanessa Palmer sat across from him, her earlier professional polish softened by the late hour and the intimacy of the nearly empty space. You have questions, she said. It wasn't a guess. Ask them. This is real. Landon gestured at the contract, at the salary figure that still seemed like a misprint. Not some publicity stunt or charity that'll disappear once the news cycle moves on. It's completely real. Brielle doesn't do publicity stunts. When she commits to something, she follows through. Vanessa pulled out her own folder, this one thicker, full of program details and organizational charts. The Community Integration Program has been in development for 6 months. We've secured funding, established partnerships with social services agencies, leased office space. All we've been missing is the right person to lead it. And you think that's me? A homeless guy with no management experience? We think you're someone who understands the population we're trying to serve, who won't look down on them or treat them as problems to be solved, but as people with potential who need opportunity. Vanessa's expression was earnest. You know what it's like to be invisible, Landon. To be dismissed based on appearance rather than ability. That perspective is invaluable. Landon took a sip of cold coffee, grimacing. What would I actually be doing? Initially, working with our HR department to develop hiring protocols that account for employment gaps, housing instability, criminal records, all the barriers that typically disqualify people from consideration, then recruiting candidates, providing support as they transition into positions, connecting them with resources like housing assistance and transportation. Vanessa pulled out another document. We've identified 50 entry-level positions across our various facilities as starting points. Warehouse work, maintenance, food service, administrative support, jobs that pay living wages and offer paths to advancement. You want me to place 50 people in jobs? To start. If the program succeeds, we'll expand. Eventually, we want to create a model that other companies can replicate. She leaned forward. Landon, Stanton Industries has the resources to make real change. But resources without understanding are useless. You bring the understanding. He looked down at the contract again, reading the terms carefully. The salary was clear. So were the benefits, health insurance, dental, vision, retirement contributions. There was a signing bonus of $5,000 to help with immediate expenses, a housing stipend of $2,000 per month while he secured permanent accommodation. Start date: immediately upon acceptance. What about Tyler? Landon asked quietly. The custody arrangement? Vanessa's expression softened. We've consulted with family law attorneys. With stable employment and housing, you'll have strong grounds to petition for modification of the custody agreement. Supervised visits could become unsupervised. Twice monthly could become weekly, then potentially shared custody. She paused. No guarantees, of course. The court will do what's best for your son. But this gives you a fighting chance. A fighting chance. That's all Landon had wanted for 8 months. Just an opportunity to prove he could be the father Tyler deserved. There's one more thing, Vanessa said, pulling out a final document. This is important, so I want to be very clear. This job offer is legitimate and separate from what you did for Brielle. You're not being hired out of gratitude or obligation. You're being hired because we believe you're the right person for this position. Do you understand the distinction? You're saying even if I hadn't saved her, I'd be getting this offer. I'm saying this program needs someone with your background and perspective. The fact that you also happen to save our CEO's life is coincidental. Timing, not the basis for employment. Vanessa's gaze was steady. We need you to be clear on that. Because this job comes with expectations and accountability. You'll have performance reviews. You'll have quotas to meet. You'll be held to the same standards as any director-level employee. Landon appreciated that. The clarity that this wasn't charity, that he'd actually have to earn his salary rather than just cash checks because he'd done one good deed. When would I start? Monday, if you accept. We'll get you set up in temporary housing this weekend. Provide an advance on your salary for immediate expenses. Get you outfitted with appropriate professional clothing. Vanessa smiled slightly. No offense, but you'll need to clean up for the office. None taken. I know how I look. You look like someone who survived 8 months on the streets and still managed to save a woman's life. There's no shame in that. She stood, gathering her folders. Think about it tonight. Call me tomorrow with your decision. But Landon, I hope you'll say yes. I think you could do remarkable things with this opportunity. After she left, Landon sat alone with the contract and his thoughts. The cafeteria was nearly empty now, just a few exhausted medical staff grabbing late-night coffee before returning to their shifts. Through the windows, he could see the city lights spreading out like a carpet of stars. Somewhere out there was the doorway, where he'd planned to sleep tonight. The shelter that might or might not have an open bed. The streets that had been his home for too long. And somewhere out there was Tyler, asleep in a house that wasn't Landon's, being raised by a stepfather who was there every day while Landon got 2 hours twice a month. This job could change that. Could give him the stability to be a real father again. Could let him show Tyler that Dad hadn't given up. That he'd kept fighting. That he'd found a way back. But it was terrifying too. What if he failed? What if he wasn't smart enough, or skilled enough, or professional enough for a director-level position? What if he proved everyone right who'd ever looked at him and seen nothing but a failure? Landon pulled out his phone, looking at Tyler's photo for strength and clarity. His son's gap-toothed smile stared back at him, full of trust and hope and love that Landon had spent 8 months trying to be worthy of. What do you think, buddy? He whispered to the photo. Should Dad take the scary leap? Tyler couldn't answer. Of course. But Landon knew what his son would say, if he could. The same thing he always said at the end of their supervised visits. Love you, Dad. See you soon. Soon. Maybe soon could mean something different now. Maybe soon could mean next weekend instead of next month. Maybe soon could mean coming home instead of saying goodbye at a community center. Landon looked at the contract one more time, at the signature line waiting for his name. Then he pulled out the pen Vanessa had left behind and signed before he could second-guess himself. Tomorrow he'd call her with his acceptance. Tomorrow he'd start the process of rebuilding his life. Tomorrow he'd take first step toward getting his son back. Tonight, though, he'd sleep in a doorway one last time. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to remember, wanted to mark the before and after, the line between who he'd been and who he was becoming. He gathered his backpack and walked out of the hospital into the cold November night. The signed contract tucked safely in his pocket. This was the last night of the old life. Monday would be the first day of the new one. And for the first time in 8 months, Landon Pierce went to sleep with something he'd almost forgotten existed: hope. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp winter clarity that made everything feel possible. Landon stood outside the Stanton Industries headquarters at 7:45, 15 minutes early for his 8 o'clock start time, wearing a suit that actually fit. The weekend had been a whirlwind. Vanessa had arranged everything with the efficiency of someone who'd made a career of solving problems. A corporate apartment in a decent neighborhood, fully furnished, with a real bed and a kitchen and a bathroom that belonged only to him. An advance of $3,000 deposited into a bank account she'd helped him open. A trip to a professional clothing store where a patient salesperson had outfitted him with 3 suits, 5 shirts, 2 pairs of shoes, and enough accessories to look like someone who belonged in an office. He'd gotten a haircut and a shave at a real barber shop, the kind with hot towels and skilled hands that made him look 10 years younger. He'd taken a long shower in his new apartment, standing under the hot water until his skin pruned, washing away 8 months of street grime and the lingering smell of doorways and desperation. And he'd called his caseworker at Family Services to report his change in circumstances. The woman had been skeptical at first, clearly accustomed to broken promises and false hope from parents trying to regain custody. But when Landon provided his employment verification letter, his lease agreement, his new address and phone number, her tone had shifted to cautious optimism. They'd scheduled a home visit for next week. If everything checked out, Tyler's next supervised visit might be the last one required. Now Landon stood outside the building where Brielle Douglas had nearly died, where his life had changed in the space of a few desperate minutes. The tower looked different in daylight, less imposing, more familiar. This was his workplace now, his future. He walked through the lobby with his new employee badge clipped to his jacket, rode the elevator to the 15th floor where the Community Integration Program offices were located, and stepped into a world he barely recognized. The space was modern and open, with glass-walled offices surrounding a central area filled with cubicles and collaboration spaces. Motivational posters lined the walls with phrases about potential and opportunity and second chances. A small kitchen area offered free coffee and snacks. Everything was clean and new and designed to make people feel valued. Landon. Vanessa appeared from one of the glass offices, smiling warmly. "Welcome to your first day. How are you feeling?" "Terrified," he admitted honestly. "Good, that means you're taking this seriously." She gestured for him to follow. "Let me show you your office." His office. Landon had never had an office before. At the manufacturing plant, he'd worked on the floor, clocking in and out, his space defined by whatever machine he was operating that day. But here, he had an actual office with his name on the door. Landon Pierce, Director of Community Integration. The space wasn't huge, but it had a desk, a computer, a bookshelf, and a window that overlooked the street below. A street where he'd walked countless times as an invisible homeless man, never imagining he'd someday look down at it from a position of authority and purpose. "Your computer is set up with all the access you'll need," Vanessa explained. "Password is on that sticky note. Change it to something secure once you log in." HR sent over the employee handbook and program documentation. "Your first meeting is at 9 with the hiring managers from our various departments." Landon sat down behind the desk, feeling like an imposter playing dress-up in someone else's life. "Vanessa, I don't know what I'm doing. I've never managed anything, never run a program, never worked in an office. None of that matters as much as you think it does." She pulled up a chair, her expression serious but kind. "Here's what I need you to understand. We're not asking you to be something you're not. We're asking you to be exactly who you are. Someone who understands the people we're trying to help, who can identify barriers and solutions that the rest of us would never see. But the business side, the corporate stuff, you'll have support for all of that. I'll be your direct supervisor and mentor. We have program coordinators who'll handle logistics and paperwork. We have legal reviewing all our procedures. Your job is to be the conscience and the vision of this initiative, to make sure we're actually helping people instead of just checking boxes for good publicity. Over the next few hours, Landon was introduced to what felt like 100 people, HR representatives who explained benefits and policies, IT staff who set up his email and showed him the company intranet, program coordinators who'd be working under his direction, young professionals with social work degrees and nonprofit experience who looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. The 9 o'clock meeting was intimidating. 15 hiring managers from different departments, all of them older and more experienced. All of them with questions about how this program would work and whether it would create more problems than it solved. "Let me be direct," said a woman named Kiana Ford, who managed the warehouse operations. "I've got productivity quotas to meet and tight schedules to maintain. How do I know someone who's been living on the streets can show up reliably and do the work?" It was the question Landon had been expecting, the skepticism he'd faced his entire time being homeless. The assumption that if you were struggling, it must be because of personal failings rather than systemic barriers. "You don't know," Landon said honestly. "Just like you don't know if any new hire will work out, regardless of their background. But here's what I do know. People experiencing homelessness aren't lazy or unreliable by nature. They're dealing with obstacles most of us can't imagine. No address means no job applications. No phone means no callbacks. No transportation means limited options. No support system means one bad day can spiral into catastrophe." He leaned forward, holding Kiana's gaze. Give someone stable housing, reliable transportation, a support system that helps them navigate challenges, and you'll find they're just as capable and dedicated as anyone else, maybe more so, because they know how precious opportunity is. Kiana considered this, her expression thoughtful. "So what do you need from me?" "Patience, flexibility, a willingness to measure success over months rather than days." Landon pulled out the program guidelines Vanessa had prepared. "We're not asking you to lower your standards. We're asking you to provide the support that helps people meet those standards." The meeting lasted 2 hours. And by the end, Landon had commitments from 12 of the 15 managers to pilot the program in their departments. It wasn't unanimous support, but it was a start. Lunch was in the executive cafeteria, a perk that came with his director title. Landon sat with Vanessa and 2 other program directors, listening to conversations about quarterly projections and stakeholder meetings and corporate strategy. He contributed little, still learning the language of this world, still feeling like someone who'd accidentally wandered into the wrong room. But in the afternoon, everything changed. His first candidate arrived at 2 o'clock. A woman named Cassidy Rhodes, 43 years old, who'd been homeless for 6 months after fleeing domestic violence. She sat across from Landon's desk and donated clothes that didn't quite fit, her hands shaking slightly, her eyes holding that same mixture of hope and fear Landon recognized from every mirror he'd looked into over the past 8 months. "Thank you for seeing me," Cassidy said quietly. "The shelter told me about this program, but I didn't think anyone would actually give me a chance. Tell me about your work history." Landon said gently. She did. 10 years as a retail manager, before her ex-husband's abuse had escalated to the point where she'd had to choose between her safety and her job. She'd left with nothing but the clothes on her back, had spent months in shelters, had applied to dozens of positions only to be rejected because of employment gaps and lack of references. "I'm a hard worker," Cassidy said, her voice gaining strength. "I'm reliable and organized and good with people. I just need someone to take a chance on me, to see past my situation to what I can actually do." Landon looked at her and saw himself. Saw every person who'd been dismissed based on circumstances rather than character. Saw the potential that society was wasting because it was easier to judge than to help. I have a position in our retail operations department, he said. Assistant manager training program. It's entry level to start, but there's a clear path to advancement. The salary is $42,000 with full benefits. We'll provide housing assistance for the first 6 months and connect you with support services. Cassidy's eyes filled with tears. You're serious? This is real? Completely real. But I need you to commit to something in return. Show up every day. Ask for help when you need it. Prove that this program works, that people like us deserve a second chance. People like us? Landon smiled slightly. I was homeless until last Friday, sleeping in doorways, wondering where my next meal would come from. Someone gave me a chance, and now I'm passing that chance forward to you. Understanding dawned on Cassidy's face. You get it. You actually understand. I do, and I promise you, Cassidy, we're going to make this work. Together. By 5 o'clock, Landon had interviewed 3 more candidates and made 2 additional hiring commitments. He'd learned more about the company's operations in one day than he'd thought possible. He'd started to feel like maybe, just maybe, he could actually do this job. As he was packing up to leave, Vanessa appeared in his doorway. How was day 1? Overwhelming. Terrifying. Amazing. Landon looked at the files on his desk. At the faces of people whose lives he might actually be able to change. I placed 3 people in jobs today, Vanessa. 3 people who probably thought they were unemployable. That's 3 lives changed. 3 families impacted. 3 people who'll tell others that second chances are real. She smiled. Not a bad first day, Director Pierce. Landon drove back to his apartment in the used car Stanton Industries had helped him purchase that weekend. He parked in an actual parking space, walked into a building where he had a key and a lease, rode an elevator to a floor where he belonged. Inside his apartment, he stood at the window, looking out at the city lights. Tomorrow was Tuesday. Wednesday, he had a meeting with the family court mediator. Saturday, he'd see Tyler, and this time he'd have so much good news to share. His phone rang. An unknown number. But Landon answered it anyway. Mr. Pierce, this is Detective Sullivan from Ashford PD. We've apprehended the 2 suspects in the attack on Miss Douglas. I thought you'd want to know. Relief washed through Landon. That's great news. Thank you for telling me. There's more. They're connected to a larger robbery ring that's been targeting executives throughout the city. Your quick thinking and the description you provided helped us break the whole case open. Sullivan paused. You did good work, Pierce, in more ways than one. After the call ended, Landon sat on his couch, his real couch in his real apartment, and let himself feel everything he'd been holding back. The fear and hope, the gratitude and determination, the overwhelming sense that his life had turned a corner he'd thought was forever blocked. He'd saved a woman's life. She'd saved his in return. And now he was helping save others, one job placement at a time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, Landon Pierce was exactly where he was supposed to be. 3 weeks into his new life, everything came crashing down with a single phone call. Landon was in his office reviewing applications when his phone rang, displaying the number for family services. His heart lifted, expecting good news about the custody modification hearing scheduled for next week. The home visit had gone well. His caseworker had been impressed with the apartment, his stable employment, his obvious commitment to providing a good environment for Tyler. Mr. Pierce, this is Jennifer Blake from Family Services. The caseworker's voice was tight, professional, carefully neutral. I'm calling about the custody hearing next Tuesday. Yes, I've been preparing all the documentation you requested. The hearing has been postponed indefinitely. Your ex-wife has filed an emergency motion opposing any modification to the current arrangement. Landon felt his stomach drop. What? Why? Why? She's claiming that your recent employment and housing situation is unstable and potentially fraudulent. That you've been given these opportunities through inappropriate means rather than legitimate qualifications. Jennifer's voice softened slightly. Mr. Pierce, she's hired an attorney who's making some serious allegations about your relationship with Miss Douglas. My relationship? I saved her life. She offered me a job. There's nothing inappropriate about any of it. The attorney is arguing that you're being compensated for heroism rather than employed based on merit. That the position was created specifically for you as a form of gratitude, and that once the publicity dies down, the job will disappear, and you'll be back on the streets. They're painting this as an unstable foundation for Tyler's well-being. Landon's hand tightened on the phone. That's not true. This is a legitimate program. I'm placing people in real jobs. I'm doing actual work. I believe you, Mr. Pierce. But beliefs don't matter in family court. Evidence does. And right now, the evidence can be interpreted to support their narrative. She paused. There's more. They've subpoenaed your employment records, including the circumstances of your hiring. They're also calling into question whether someone who was homeless 3 weeks ago can suddenly be trusted with parental responsibility. I'm Tyler's father. I've always been his father, whether I had a home or not. I understand that. But the court's primary concern is the boy's best interests. Your ex-wife's attorney is going to argue that Tyler has stability with his mother and stepfather, that disrupting that stability based on your very recent and potentially temporary change in circumstances would be harmful. After the call ended, Landon sat staring at his computer screen without seeing it. Everything he'd built over the past 3 weeks, every step forward, was being used against him. His homelessness proved he was irresponsible. His new job proved nothing except that someone felt sorry for him. His determination to get Tyler back proved he was selfish, willing to disrupt his son's stability for his own desires. There was a knock on his door. Vanessa entered, took one look at his face, and closed the door behind her. What happened? He told her everything. The postponed hearing, the allegations, the argument that his job was charity rather than employment. When he finished, Vanessa's expression was tight with anger. That's absurd. You've placed 17 people in positions in 3 weeks. You've developed protocols that our HR department is already adopting company-wide. You've brought perspective and insight that none of us had before. She pulled out her phone. I'm calling our legal department. We'll provide documentation, testimony, whatever the court needs to see that this is legitimate employment. Will it matter? Landon asked tiredly. Or will it just look like the company protecting its good publicity? Vanessa had no answer for that. The next few days were brutal. Landon tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting to Tyler, to the supervised visits that might be all he ever got, to the possibility that his son would grow up thinking Dad had abandoned him rather than fought desperately to be part of his life. His performance suffered. He missed details in applications, zoned out during meetings, snapped at a program coordinator who made a minor mistake. The work that had felt purposeful and important now felt hollow, a house of cards that could collapse at any moment. On Thursday, Brielle called him to her office. She'd returned to work the previous week, still moving carefully but determined to resume her duties. Her office was on the 40th floor, a space that screamed power and success with its panoramic city views and expensive furnishings. Landon had been up here once before, right after starting the job. Now, he entered feeling like he was about to be fired. Sit down, Landon. Brielle's voice was gentle but firm. She looked better than she had in the hospital, color back in her cheeks, the haunted look gone from her eyes. But there was concern there now as she studied him. Vanessa told me about the custody situation. I'm sorry if it's affecting my work. I'll do better. Stop. She held up a hand. You're not here to be reprimanded. You're here because I want to help, but I need to understand the full situation first. Tell me everything. So he did. About Tyler, about the divorce, about 8 months of supervised visits and broken promises, and a boy who kept asking when Dad was coming home. About the custody modification request that had seemed so promising just days ago. About his ex-wife's attorney painting him as an opportunist, taking advantage of a grateful CEO. When he finished, Brielle was quiet for a long moment, her fingers steepled under her chin. "They're using me against you," she said finally. "Using the fact that I gave you this job as proof that you're unreliable. It's not your fault. You gave me a legitimate opportunity. How you chose to use it is your own choice." She stood, pacing to the window. "But I can help. I can testify in court if needed. I can provide documentation about the program, about your performance, about the fact that this job exists independent of gratitude. It won't matter. They'll say you're biased, that you have a personal investment in making me look good to justify your own decision to hire me. Then we need to change the narrative." Brielle turned back to face him, her expression determined. "Show them this isn't about one good deed. Show them you're building something real and lasting. Something that exists beyond me, beyond the publicity, beyond any single person." How? The Community Integration Summit is in 2 weeks. 400 business leaders from across the region, all gathered to discuss corporate social responsibility. "You're scheduled to present the program results." She moved back to her desk, pulling up a calendar on her computer. "Make it undeniable. Show them the 17 people you've placed. Show them the retention rates, the productivity metrics, the cost, benefit analysis. Show them this is a legitimate program run by a legitimate professional who happens to have lived experience, not a charity case playing at employment." Landon felt a flicker of hope. "You think that would make a difference? I think it's your best chance. If you can prove to a room full of skeptical executives that this program works, and that you're the reason it works, no family court attorney can dismiss you as someone taking advantage of misplaced gratitude. That's a lot of pressure. You've handled more pressure than most people ever face. You survived on the streets while maintaining your dignity and your commitment to your son. You ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. You built a program from nothing in 3 weeks." Brielle's gaze was steady. "You can handle a presentation to a bunch of people in suits. Over the Riels. Next week." Landon threw himself into preparation with desperate focus. He compiled data on every placement he'd made, tracking not just hirings but retention rates, performance reviews, and feedback from managers. He interviewed the people he'd helped, gathering their stories, documenting their successes. Cassidy Rhodes, the domestic violence survivor, had exceeded all expectations in her retail training program and was being fast-tracked to full manager. A man named Grayson Foster, formerly incarcerated and homeless, was thriving in the warehouse and had just received his first promotion. A young woman who'd aged out of foster care was excelling in administrative support and taking night classes toward a degree. 17 placements. 16 still employed and performing well. One who'd left for a better opportunity at another company, which Landon counted as a success rather than a failure. Stories of lives transformed, families stabilized, potential fulfilled. He worked 18-hour days, barely sleeping, surviving on coffee and determination. Vanessa tried to get him to slow down, to take care of himself, but Landon couldn't stop. This presentation wasn't just about the program anymore. It was about proving he deserved to be Tyler's father. It was about showing the world that people like him, people who'd struggled and fallen and fought their way back, had value beyond their worst moments. The night before the summit, Landon sat in his apartment reviewing his presentation for the 100th time. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I heard about the custody hearing. I'm sorry. But I know you're going to fight for Tyler the same way you fought for me. That's who you are. You don't give up." Brielle. Landon stared at the message, feeling emotion tighten his throat. She was right. He didn't give up. Couldn't give up, because somewhere in this city, his 8-year-old son was going to sleep thinking about Saturday's visit, thinking about whether Dad would keep his promises this time, and Landon would keep them. No matter what it took, no matter how hard he had to fight, he'd prove to the court, to his ex-wife, to himself, that he was worthy of being Tyler's father. Tomorrow, he'd face a room full of executives and show them what second chances looked like when given to the right person. He'd prove that his job was real, his transformation was lasting, his worth was undeniable. Tomorrow, everything changed. Again, the Ashford Convention Center was filled to capacity. 400 executives in expensive suits filled the auditorium seats, their faces reflecting various degrees of interest, skepticism, and boredom, as they waited for the next presenter in the day-long summit on corporate social responsibility. Landon stood backstage, his presentation loaded on a USB drive in his pocket, his hands shaking despite every effort to steady them. Through a gap in the curtain, he could see the crowd. These were the people who made hiring decisions that affected thousands of lives. The people who set policies and created barriers and decided who deserved opportunities. In the front row sat Brielle, her presence a quiet show of support. Beside her was Vanessa, and several other Stanton Industries executives. And scattered throughout the audience were the 17 people Landon had placed in jobs over the past month, invited to witness this moment and show the human face of the program's success. "You're on in 2 minutes," a stage manager said, handing him a microphone. Landon clipped it to his lapel with fingers that still trembled slightly. He'd rehearsed this presentation 100 times, had every word memorized, every slide timed perfectly. But now, facing the reality of standing before hundreds of people who would judge him, who held the power to validate or dismiss everything he'd built, the fear was almost paralyzing. He thought about Tyler, about the custody hearing that would resume next month if this went well, that would become permanent separation if it didn't. About 8 months of seeing his son for 2 hours at a time, watching him grow up from a distance, being dad in name only. That thought steadied him. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about Tyler. It was about proving he deserved to be a father to his boy. "Landon Pierce, you're up," the stage manager said. He walked onto the stage into bright lights and the sea of faces. The moderator introduced him with a brief bio that still felt surreal. Director of Community Integration at Stanton Industries, formerly homeless, known for saving CEO Brielle Douglas from a violent attack. The room quieted, curiosity replacing boredom. They wanted to see if the homeless hero could actually speak coherently or if this was just a publicity stunt. Landon stood at the podium, adjusted the microphone, and made a decision. He closed the laptop with his carefully crafted presentation and spoke from his heart instead. "4 weeks ago, I was sleeping in a doorway 3 blocks from here," he began, his voice steady despite the fear. "I owned everything I had in a backpack. I saw my son for 2 hours every other week under supervision because the court had decided I couldn't provide stability, and I wondered every single day whether I'd survive to see him grow up." The room was completely silent now. "I'm not going to show you PowerPoint slides about retention rates and cost-benefit analyses, though I have them and they're impressive. I'm not going to drown you in data about the economic impact of hiring marginalized populations, though that data exists, and it's compelling." He paused. "Instead, I'm going to tell you about Cassidy." He gestured to the front row where Cassidy Rhodes sat, tears already streaming down her face. Cassidy fled domestic violence with nothing but the clothes on her back. She spent 6 months in shelters, applied to 73 jobs, and got 0 callbacks because she had an employment gap and no permanent address. When she came to my office 4 weeks ago, she was convinced she'd never work again, that society had decided she was disposable. Landon pulled up a single slide, a photo of Cassidy in her retail management uniform, smiling with genuine pride. Today, Cassidy is assistant manager at our flagship retail location. Her supervisor calls her the best hire they've made in 5 years. She has her own apartment. She's rebuilding her life, and all she needed was one person to see past her circumstances to her capabilities. He clicked to the next slide. Grayson Foster in the warehouse, operating a forklift. Grayson spent 3 years in prison for a mistake he made when he was 19. He got out with a record that made him unhireable. When I met him, He'd been rejected from 42 jobs in 6 months, not because he wasn't qualified, but because our hiring systems are designed to permanently punish people for their worst moments. Another click. A young woman at a desk, focused on her computer screen. This is Summer Holt. She aged out of foster care at 18, with no family, no support system, and no idea how to navigate adult life. She was homeless by 19, not because she was lazy or irresponsible, but because the system that raised her abandoned her the moment she hit legal adulthood. Landon looked out at the audience, meeting eyes, seeing his words land. I could show you 15 more stories just like these. People with incredible potential, who were invisible to our traditional hiring systems. People who wanted nothing more than a chance to prove themselves. He closed the laptop entirely, stepping out from behind the podium. Here's what I've learned in 4 weeks of running this program. Talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. There are thousands of people in this city right now who could excel in your companies, who could bring perspectives and experiences that would make your businesses better, who are desperate for the chance to work and contribute and rebuild their lives. But you'll never find them with traditional hiring practices. So, what do we do differently? Someone called from the audience. We remove barriers that have nothing to do with. So, the ability to perform the job. We stop requiring permanent addresses when most positions don't need one. We look at skills rather than gaps in employment. We provide support during transitions instead of expecting people to have it all figured out on day one. Landon's voice grew stronger. And most importantly, we recognize that past circumstances don't define future potential. He looked directly at a section of the audience where he knew several CEOs were sitting. I know some of you are thinking this sounds expensive or risky or complicated. And you're right, it requires investment and intentionality. But let me give you the numbers you actually care about. Landon rattled off statistics he'd memorized. Retention rates, 20% higher than traditional hires. Productivity metrics that exceeded expectations. Employee satisfaction scores that suggested these workers were more grateful for opportunities and more committed to proving themselves. Cost savings from reduced turnover and training expenses. But here's the number that matters most, he said. 17. That's how many lives have been transformed in just 4 weeks. 17 people who were invisible are now valued employees. 17 families that have moved from crisis to stability. 17 human beings who matter. His voice dropped to almost a whisper, forcing the audience to lean in. I was number 18. Someone saw past my circumstances to my potential. Someone decided I was worth investing in despite every reason to walk away. And because of that single decision, I'm standing here today, running a program that's changing lives, working toward getting my son back, proving that second chances aren't just charity. They're good business and basic humanity. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, someone in the back started clapping. Others joined. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, applause rolling through the space like thunder. Landon stood at the podium, overwhelmed by the response, barely able to process what was happening. Through the crowd, he saw Brielle smiling with tears on her face, saw Cassidy and Grayson and Summer and all the others he'd helped, their expressions radiating pride and validation. The moderator returned to the stage, had to wait for the applause to die down before speaking. Thank you, Mr. Pierce. That was extraordinary. We have time for a few questions. Hands shot up across the auditorium. For the next 20 minutes, Landon fielded questions about implementation, about scaling the program, about specific barriers and solutions. He answered honestly, admitting what he didn't know, sharing what he'd learned, offering to connect interested companies with resources. When the session finally ended, he was swarmed by executives wanting to talk more, wanting contact information, wanting to replicate the program in their own organizations. Landon handed out business cards, scheduled follow-up calls, felt the surreal, Reality, that he'd just convinced hundreds of business leaders that hiring marginalized populations wasn't just moral but smart. Brielle found him in the chaos, pulling him aside into a quiet corner. That was incredible, Landon. You didn't just present data. You changed minds. You made them see people they'd been overlooking their entire careers. I just told the truth. The truth delivered with passion and authenticity by someone who's lived it. That's powerful. She squeezed his arm. This is going to help with the custody hearing. No attorney can dismiss you as unstable or unqualified after what just happened. I hope you're right. I know I'm right. You just proved to 400 influential people that you're exactly who I said you were. Someone with incredible value who needed opportunity, not charity. The court will see the same thing. 2 weeks later, Landon sat in family court with his attorney, facing his ex-wife and her lawyer across the aisle. The custody hearing had finally resumed, and both sides were presenting their cases. His ex-wife's attorney went first, making the arguments Landon had expected. Recent employment, unstable history, the question of whether someone homeless a month ago could suddenly provide appropriate stability for a young boy. Then Landon's attorney stood, armed with documentation that told a very different story. Employment verification from a Fortune 500 company, performance reviews that exceeded expectations, a video of Landon's presentation at the summit that had been viewed over 100,000 times online, testimony from Brielle about the legitimacy of his position, letters from the 17 people he'd helped, attesting to his character and his impact. The judge reviewed everything carefully, asked pointed questions, and finally rendered her decision. Mr. Pierce, I'm impressed by the transformation you've made in your circumstances. However, my primary concern is, and always will be, the well-being of your son. She paused, and Landon felt his heart sink. Therefore, I'm modifying the custody arrangement to allow for unsupervised visits every weekend, with reassessment in 6 months for potential shared custody. It took a moment for the words to register. Unsupervised visits. Every weekend. He'd get to spend real time with Tyler, not just supervised hours at a community center. He'd get to take his son to his apartment, to cook him meals, to be dad in a way he hadn't been allowed to be in 8 months. Thank you, Your Honor, Landon managed, his voice thick with emotion. Outside the courtroom, his attorney shook his hand firmly. You did it, Landon. You proved them wrong. No, Landon said, thinking about Brielle and Vanessa and all the people who'd helped him get here. We did it. Together. That Saturday, Landon picked up Tyler from his ex-wife's house for the first time in 8 months. His son ran to him with a squeal of joy, throwing his arms around Landon's neck. You get to come to my place today, buddy, Landon said, his voice breaking. We can play games and make dinner, and just hang out. No timer. No supervision. Just us. Really? Tyler's eyes were wide with excitement. Your real place? My real place. Come on, I'll show you. As they drove to the apartment, Tyler chattering excitedly about everything he wanted to do, Landon felt peace settle over him for the first time in longer than he could remember. He had his son beside him. He had meaningful work that changed lives. He had people who believed in him, and a future that looked brighter than he'd dared to imagine just weeks ago. He'd run toward danger and saved a woman's life. She'd returned the favor by giving him a chance to save his own. And now he was passing that gift forward to others, one opportunity at a time. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, more moments when he'd doubt himself. But Landon knew now that he could overcome them. He'd survived the streets. He'd fought for his son. He'd proven his worth to skeptics and built something meaningful from nothing. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer disposable. He was Landon Pierce, father, director, proof that second chances could transform lives, and that was worth fighting for. 6 months had passed since that cold November evening, when Landon Pierce's life had changed forever. Spring had arrived in Ashford City, bringing warmth and renewal, and the kind of light that made everything feel possible. Landon stood outside the Stanton Tower at 6:30 in the evening, the same spot where Brielle Douglas had collapsed bleeding on the pavement, where he'd made the split-second decision to run toward danger instead of away from it. The sidewalk showed no trace of that night now. The blood had been washed away by rain and time, the violence absorbed back into the city's endless cycle of forgetting and moving forward. But Landon remembered. He'd never forget the weight of her life in his hands. The desperate pressure against a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. The choice that had seemed so simple in the moment, but had carried consequences he couldn't have imagined. "Dad, are you okay?" Tyler's voice pulled him from his thoughts. His son stood beside him, backpack slung over one shoulder, looking up with those perceptive eyes that seemed to understand more than an 8-year-old should. "I'm good, buddy. Just thinking about how much things have changed." Tyler slipped his hand into Landon's. "Because this is where you saved Miss Brielle." "Yeah, this is where everything started." They'd developed a Friday evening routine over the past few months. Landon would pick Tyler up from his mother's house after school, and they'd spend the entire weekend together. Real time, father and son, building the relationship that 8 months of supervised visits had nearly broken. Tonight they were meeting Brielle for dinner at her favorite restaurant, a casual tradition that had emerged from genuine friendship rather than obligation or gratitude. "Do you ever wish it didn't happen?" Tyler asked. "That you didn't have to see Miss Brielle get hurt?" Landon considered the question carefully. If that night had never happened, he'd likely still be on the streets. Still, seeing Tyler for 2 hours every other week. Still invisible to a world that had decided he didn't matter. The cost had been trauma and fear and the weight of someone's life in his hands. But the gift had been everything else. "No," he said honestly. "Because it brought me back to you. And that's worth anything." The community integration program had expanded beyond anything Landon had envisioned in those early nervous days. What had started as 17 placements had grown to over 200 across 15 partner companies. Other cities were reaching out, wanting to replicate the model. Landon had been invited to speak at conferences across the country, sharing his story and the framework that made second chances sustainable rather than just symbolic. But the numbers, impressive as they were, weren't what mattered most to him. It was the individual lives. The single mother who'd been homeless and was now managing a team of 20. The veteran with PTSD who'd found stability and his purpose in warehouse logistics. The young man who'd aged out of foster care and discovered a talent for graphic design. Each one represented a person who'd been invisible becoming valued, someone society had discarded becoming essential. Cassidy Rhodes had been promoted to regional retail manager, overseeing 5 locations. Grayson Foster was training new warehouse employees and studying for his logistics certification. Summer Holt had graduated from community college and was applying to 4-year universities. Their success stories had become the program's foundation, proof that investing in people worked when done with intention and support. Landon's own life had stabilized in ways that still sometimes felt surreal. The apartment had become home, filled with Tyler's drawings on the refrigerator and toys scattered across the living room floor. The job had evolved from terrifying responsibility to genuine calling, work that mattered in tangible ways, and his relationship with Brielle had deepened into real friendship, built on mutual respect rather than the dramatic circumstances of their meeting. She'd recovered fully from the attack, though she still carried a scar beneath her ribs that matched the one on Landon's conscience. The 2 men who'd stabbed her were serving 15-year sentences. Their arrests had led to the dismantling of a larger criminal network, saving other potential victims from similar violence. "There she is," Tyler said, pointing toward the tower entrance where Brielle emerged in casual clothes, her face lighting up when she saw them. "My 2 favorite guys," she said warmly, hugging Tyler first and then Landon. "Ready for dinner? Can we get pizza?" Tyler asked hopefully. "We always get pizza." Brielle laughed. "But yes, we can absolutely get pizza." As they walked toward the restaurant, Tyler running ahead to look in shop windows, Brielle fell into step beside Landon. "I got the final reports from the program review board," she said. They're recommending we double our budget and expand to 10 more cities next year. That's incredible. It's your work, Landon. You built something that changes lives. That matters. She paused. I've been thinking about that night a lot lately. About how random it was. How easily you could have walked past. How differently everything could have turned out. But I didn't walk past. No, you didn't. And because you made one brave choice, hundreds of people now have opportunities they wouldn't have had. Families are stable. Lives are transformed. That ripple effect, it keeps spreading. Brielle looked at him seriously. You saved more than just my life that night, Landon. You saved your own. And then you turned around and started saving others. Landon thought about the doorway where he'd slept his last night as a homeless man, about the supervised visits that had felt like torture, about the desperate hopelessness that had colored everything before that November evening. You gave me a chance when no one else would, he said quietly. You saw something worth investing in when the rest of the world saw someone disposable. That's the real gift. We gave each other chances. That's what people do when they actually see each other as human beings instead of categories or statistics. She smiled. You taught me that. You reminded me what courage and character look like when they're not calculated or strategic, just genuine. Tyler called back to them from the restaurant entrance. Come on, I'm hungry. They hurried to catch up, and as Landon held the door for his son and his friend, he caught his reflection in the glass. He looked different now. The lines of worry and desperation had softened. The haunted look had been replaced by something steadier, more grounded. He looked like someone who belonged, who had purpose, who mattered. 6 months ago, he'd been a homeless single father, with nothing but determination and a backpack full of belongings. He'd witnessed violence and made a choice that could have cost him everything. He'd run toward danger because someone needed help, because it was the right thing to do, because he'd still believed that actions mattered even when the world had given him every reason to stop caring. That choice had changed everything, had given him back his son, his dignity, his future, had shown him that second chances were real when offered by people who genuinely saw your worth, had proven that one moment of courage could create ripples that spread far beyond anything you could imagine. As they settled into their booth, and Tyler immediately started lobbying for extra cheese on his pizza, Landon felt something he'd thought was lost forever: complete peace. Not the absence of challenges or the guarantee of easy days ahead, but the deep knowledge that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, surrounded by people who mattered. He'd saved a CEO's life on a freezing street corner. She'd saved his in return. And together, they were building a legacy that proved courage and compassion could change the world, one second chance at a time. The journey from that doorway to this moment had been terrifying and transformative, marked by struggle and triumph, fear and hope. But Landon wouldn't change a single step, because this, right here, was worth everything it had cost to get here. His son's laughter, his meaningful work, his friendships, his proof that redemption was real and second chances mattered. This was home. This was purpose. This was life. And Landon Pierce intended to make every moment of it count. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.